Hey, welcome to another insightful discussion here on the Champion's Path, a platform for all things simulation and training based, designed for our champions in the military, law enforcement, and other critical first responder roles. I'm here with Mick Byrne, co founder of EmergiSim, a virtual reality emergency medical training software company based out of Australia that's developed realistic and complex medical training programs for the military and civilian medical practitioners. Mick, thank you for joining with me today.
Pleasure, Jared. Yeah, awesome to be here.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of innovation coming out of Australia. I actually recently had the pleasure of picking Kim Hopwood's brain over at Operator XR. They're developing VR close quarters combat skills simulation software, as well as counter drone measures, and they partner with another Australian company, Drone Shield.
Yep.
So yeah, really exciting stuff coming out of Australia.
I don't know why that is. But it's interesting again. So so
Mm-hmm.
so Kim and those guys are doing some really good stuff. I mean, we sort of try and stay across what they're working on, and vice versa,
Mm-hmm.
just because there's a lot of shared DNA in the groups that we talk to and work with. Um,
Right.
Again, it's a big space. We've never sort of considered ourselves direct
Mm-hmm.
competitors, just because our
Mm-hmm.
focus is very very different. Um, and again, I think rising tide, again, even in the
Mm-hmm.
tactical medical space, I think rising tide helps all ships to increase the visibility of this as a training modality, but also then the quality of the
Mm-hmm.
simulations and the quality of the training
Mm-hmm.
that is out there in the space. So look, it's a good thing, and yeah, I don't know what it is about the water down here, but there's some
Mm-hmm.
there's some cool stuff and some very creative stuff that's happening.
Yeah, and I don't want to take away from your summary of EmergiSim and its founders, but there is shared collaborative efforts within the special operations community that may bring your two companies together.
Yep.
So Mick, if you wouldn't mind, taking a moment to give us a brief summary of yourself and EmergiSim's mission.
Sure. I mean, just say EmergiSim was essentially the genesis of the idea was a collaboration between two companies, TACMed Australia, who are a tactical medical training company, and a VR development studio called Spectre Studios. That was 2020. The idea being that Spectre, which was where I was working at the time, was heavily involved in the gaming and film and media space. So putting together VR experiences in collaboration with upcoming films. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the idea that they could take assets while they were being filmed and then translate them into gaming experiences or immersive experiences that would support the launch of the film. Problem with the film industry is it's very fickle. And the industry is either feast or famine in most cases. And we had all of this talent around immersive media and VR development. It's like, well, what else are we going to do? So it made sense to look at the training space just because, again, there's a lot of opportunity there. I was
Mm-hmm.
interested in the medical space just because it looked like an intriguing space to look at. I reached out to the founding team at TACMed, who were looking at essentially the same thing but from an opposite angle. They were really interested in high fidelity, repeatable, deployable simulations around mass casualty primarily.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that there are more patients than there are responders, and that's something that doesn't get trained very well throughout most agencies. And again, that's I'm talking on the civilian side, but also in a military context as well. Um, that it gets talked about a lot in theory, and then they might pull together a pot of money to do a simulation or to do a large all day simulation and involve lots of groups of people, but that's every 18 months or 24 months, so it's not necessarily something that people get a chance to get their hands dirty on and get a real experience with. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just the nature of the budgets that these groups are working with. um, so if we have a mission and a mandate, it's the fact that the first responder responsibility is if there is a tourniquet to be applied, it doesn't matter your role. Your job is to apply
Mm-hmm.
that tourniquet and to deliver a life-saving intervention. It's not a case of standing back and waiting for the medic to turn up. That's
Mm-hmm.
part of your responsibility and your duty, and that's across fire, that's across law enforcement, and that's across even the volunteer medic community as well. So we started with this premise of, all right, well, mass casualty is very difficult to simulate. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
preparation, there's a lot of setup, there's a lot of cleanup and pack down, and then the ability to actually run simulations multiple times. Um, given that you could make mistakes and learn from your mistakes and get constructive feedback around your performance, that, you know,
Mm.
if we could provide that in virtual reality, then that would give an extra level of value to the training modalities that they were already running. So we've never seen VR as a replacement for live simulation training. We've never seen it as a replacement for mannequin based training either. It's an augment that sort of sits between the two. And if we look at tourniquet application as a really simple example, is that you can practice a tourniquet on your own limb, on a mannequin limb, in a variety of different situations for the physical skill. But the decision to apply it, the decision to see the need for it, the decision to ration them, or to look at to request extra resources in a situation where you might need to apply several at the same time, that's something we could put into VR. That's something we could actually attach a performance timescale to, and a decision-making framework to, which would be really valuable for lots of different types of audiences. So EmergiSim sort of developed out of that initial mass casualty premise. We've since developed a number of different scenarios that sort of expand off that original idea. And again, we can sort of dive into them in more detail, but things like pediatric resuscitations, cardiac arrest for the civilian first responder side, and then moving into things like tactical combat casualty care, which is the military application of life-saving interventions, but while under fire, and usually with some sort of extraction, casualty removal process as well. Does that sort of give you a brief over the initial goals?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're hitting all these bells right now, and my brain and gears are turning. And we're definitely going to dive into it. And I think one of the most important aspects of a simulator is the fidelity. And there's a misconception of what that actually means. And if we're talking about the immersion with the tech side, the technology that's involved, that's appropriate to the training, as well as the psychological fidelity, because there's plenty of studies, and again, we'll kind of dive in and touch on this later. But yeah, there are studies that suggest that not necessarily visual fidelity aids in the feeling of presence or the feeling of the immersion, but actually the psychological fidelity. So with those high stressful situations such as combat, or the civilian sector of the environment, adding to the stress and inoculating the practitioners is something that I find very important in a simulation system.
Yeah.
So,
and if we talk about what is the magic trick that's really involved here, is that we will use a combination of visual stimuli, haptic feedback, usually through controllers or wearable systems, the audio component, and the idea behind a magic trick is that what the eye sees visually, the mind makes connections about the things and the bits and pieces in the middle. So we've seen, again, some of the studies and stuff you've referenced there, again, the fact that I'm 100% focused inside a VR simulation. There's nothing, I can't look away from the screen. I can't lose focus on the whiteboard or the PowerPoint or anything like that. I'm 100% engaged. But I've watched some very, let's just say, cynical practitioners who aren't convinced around the reality of this. I've watched them step over bodies that don't exist in a simulation. I've watched them snap into their muscle memory as first responders very, very quickly. And it's fascinating just to sort of watch that as soon as you have this sort of sniff that it is, I've been here before. This is where my training relates to. The suspension of disbelief happens very, very quickly. Now, there's a lot of modalities in VR that can bring you out of reality, and we can talk about those as well. So things like locomotion and having controllers and all that sort of stuff. But we were very intentional in the design of our simulations that there was going to be no health bars over the top of your head. There was going to be no prompts. There was going to be no scores. There was going to be no arrows that pointed to what you needed to do next.
Interesting.
If you miss something, you've missed something. And part of, I think the stress of simulation as well is you're going through your clinical pathways. You're saying, all right, look, have I done my ABCDEF? Have I gone through
Mm-hmm.
and done everything in my correct order? And it's perfectly fine to go back and check. And if
Mm-hmm.
anything, there's a lesson in that to say, well, look, if you're not sure, go back and check again, because the worst thing you
Right.
can do is leave a hemorrhage
Mm-hmm.
unattended, or leave an airway
Mm-hmm.
unmanaged, and
Mm-hmm.
think you've done it in your head and not having
Mm-hmm.
done it. So again, I love the idea of failing in simulation. I love the idea of critical feedback in simulation to say, look, hey, that was a
Mm-hmm.
big mistake, but far better you've made it in virtual reality
Right.
than in any other situation.
Right. No one's died.
Yeah, far better to make mistakes
Mm-hmm.
in simulation than to
Right.
have them happen in the field. And this is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, there's a value in, oh, the idea that you train like you fight, or you train in a harder situation than you fight, to means that when you're in the
Mm-hmm.
field at the worst, you've potentially seen the worst of possible scenario or situation in your training, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
you're more resilient, or you're more situationally aware in the life
Mm-hmm.
cycle. Again, that's impossible to fully prepare for, but
Mm-hmm.
the more realistic and the more stressful your simulations are, then hopefully we're creating
Right.
a resilience there as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And, some mental files to pull from through experience, and running through these scenarios uh, gives you the confidence and in the real world and in the field, it allows you to observe and make better critical decisions when you've already had the experience, especially in a training environment, at
Yeah,
least to initially get you
yeah.
uh, up and running.
And look, you and I can be taught any skill and we can
Hmm.
understand it from a theoretical sense, but until we're pressure
Hmm.
tested around that skill, it's
Hmm.
like, again, it's a theoretical application, and some people
Hmm.
pick things up quicker than others. But
Hmm.
the idea that, again, as this is an enhancement to existing training. So we'll do our physical
Hmm.
simulation via mannequins. We'll have a whiteboard process. We'll have a mnemonic in our head of what is our process to go through. But now let's
Hmm.
give you the chance to pressure test it and apply
Hmm.
what you've learned. And there will be feedback to learn. And everybody's going to have a different path to competency. There's some really interesting research as well around, again, I learn a skill, or you and I practice a skill, and we get really good at it over a short period of time. But then what happens to our skill decay over 30 days, 60 days, 90
Hmm.
days, 6 months? Like, if we're not rehearsing or drilling this
Hmm.
skill, at what point is this decaying to a
Hmm.
part where our skill is essentially useless? Um, and this has been an interesting bit of feedback from some
Yeah.
of the various civilian groups we've talked to, is that, again, the longer you've been in the job, the more
Hmm.
confident you are about your skills without necessarily having done the reps or the rehearsals to
Hmm.
maintain that skill. And that's an
Right.
interesting ego failure, which is pretty prevalent, right? Unless
Hmm.
I went to the gym, 2 years ago. That doesn't mean I can bench press the same as what I think I can do now. And that's,
Right. Right.
having VR as a way of testing that, and a way of sort of
Hmm.
giving validity to your skills. Okay, so maybe you need to
Yeah.
practice this more often. Is
Yeah,
a valid.
absolutely. These are perishable skills, and the importance of recurring training. So, I'd like to kind of expand upon this. Discussing some of the current trends and challenges practitioners face in the domains of training and the real world. And I'll share, my thoughts, and then, of course, I'd ultimately like to get your feedback. Um, so, the first obstacle that I perceive as being a big challenge are remote teams and other teams that have, very limited access to quality training. And in 2017, Johnson and Johnson conducted a virtual reality study comparing two groups, one traditionally trained and the other traditionally trained, but with integrated VR interactive scenarios. And the healthcare industry has always been an early adopter of virtual reality technology and has recognized its valuable role in improving training. So, long story short, the study concluded that 80% of the traditionally trained surgeons required assistance on their first few real world minor surgeries, while only 20% of those traditionally trained surgeons were able to conduct those minor surgeries without assistance.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, and this is where it gets very interesting, especially to dive in and explore further. 100% of the VR trained surgeons were able to conduct their first surgery successfully without any aid in from a senior clinical surgeon.
Yeah.
So, based on their experiences with the procedures from start to finish, and I'm speaking within the virtual reality, and like you had mentioned, integrated within the classroom instruction and FTX field training exercises. They were able to observe and interact with NPC patients and other staff members, etc.
Yeah.
And so again, I found it very intriguing. And the genesis of their research was a very serious challenge presented in remote areas in Africa, and the lack of availability and quality of education and supervision in remote locations. And of course, this translates to really any remote location or location struggling with obtaining quality training and reoccurring training, like you had mentioned. So I'm interested in your thoughts around either the study or the challenge of
the challenge around distance.
remote teams. Yeah,
The challenge
absolutely.
around distance is very is very familiar for us. So again,
Mm-hmm.
the geography of Australia is that we have 7 very large, spread apart states. So every ambulance, police, and fire service is state based. But that can be covering thousands of square kilometers. So you've got obviously the major metropolitan areas will have lots of stations, lots of people. But then as you get sort of more regional, rural, you could have a single station with a single car, and there could be several hours distance between hospitals and backup resources and things like that. So
and
just
possible volunteers.
again, there's a lot and people on call and there's also this sort of this the structure holds itself together, somehow. But the reality of this is that when we looked at mass casualty or the idea of a large scale emergency, is that it's not budgetarily feasible to run a mass casualty simulation in every small regional area of New South Wales. So this is the state that we live in Australia, New South Wales. So it's just not possible. There's not the budget, there's not the trainers, and just the logistics of moving people, of setting up moulage and rolling a car and actors and all this. Like, it's just not possible. So there's a cost of, we're either traveling people to central locations in order to run this training, then we're creating a gap in their local areas, or we're trying to drive trainers around to do smaller versions, so they're not getting the full scale of training that their city or their more regional metropolitan counterparts might get. So again, part of the use case of this is to say, well, look, if I can send a kit, if I can send 2 headsets and a laptop in either as a piece of kit that can be driven or shipped, or with a trainer who's already going around to do work with these groups anyway, and that they could get the same level of training that would be involved in a 30 or 40 person simulation setup, then we're adding a greater level of augment to the organization. We're delivering a greater training signature to the organization. And the fact that training would be comparable in terms of size, scale, time, volume, all these different variables, we could also achieve a level of consistency of training across the organization that would be impossible to do. The idea that if you're in regional New South Wales and your application of a tourniquet is on scale with someone who's based in Sydney, who potentially is doing this training every 18 months, that starts to become really interesting data for the organization to say, well, look, right, are there gaps in our training? Are there other things that we need to address that VR has identified that we could be doing better? And that's that tyranny of distance is a big issue, and even with our clients in the US, again, a lot of them are spread out over some pretty diverse distances. The time just to bring people together for a training session means that there's a lack of resources in other areas, and it's not always possible. But I can get 2, 3, 4 people at a time. We can run small group things. We can run several of them, and the information's all been cataloged and aggregated against each other.
Yeah, interesting. It from my perspective, it's really that this design is on the forefront of redefining traditional medical training models, which seems to haven't changed in hundreds of years, this master and apprentice style of learning, where they receive their formal training. And then early on, they start becoming familiar with common medical problems.
Yep.
And then through observation and assistance from a supervisor, they move into more independent roles.
Yeah.
And, like we had discussed, I'm not saying VR is end all be all, but it's clearly a proven path moving forward. And a lot of VR medical studies
Mm.
that show this, and giving exposure to them, and them having the opportunity to be exposed to a multitude of medical scenarios,
Yeah.
giving the practitioners experience with medical problems and emergencies, and giving them the ability to train anytime and anywhere.
That's a
Um,
really
that's
important
that's
point.
amazing.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's a really important point, and maybe just to expand on that a little bit, but there is a value in the shared wisdom and experience
Hmm.
of those who've gone before you.
Mm.
So the fact, again, you can have a great mentor, probationary sort of relationship, and that's fantastic, and you benefit
Hmm.
from the wisdom of that direct mentor. But we can also take stories, experiences, difficult days, and turn them
Hmm.
into VR learning experiences that can be now shared with
Hmm.
thousands more people. So a really simple example of that is we have a roadside vehicle accident. There's patient's been ejected from the car. You've got one with an amputation you've got to deal with. You've got drivers dead in the steering wheel. So that's immediately very overwhelming. You've got a lot of stuff to manage straight away.
Right.
Now, in the back of the car is a child's baby seat. Now,
Mm.
there is no baby in the simulation, but it's there for the simple reason that if you miss that,
Mm.
there's a teachable moment there after the simulation. Like, did you see the baby seat? Nah, completely missed it.
Mm.
Or if it did, your next thought has to be, okay, well, where is the bub? Do I have to ask my patients, or do I have to look for it? Now,
Mhm.
that's come from a situation that one of our founding team experienced, where there was a baby thrown from the what just say fell out of the baby seat in the impact of the
Mhm.
accident, and was in the footwell of the
Mm.
passenger seat for a good 2 hours, and no
Mm.
one was aware of it. And again,
Wow.
when they've figured it out, when they made the connection, cool, found Bub. Okay, Bub's fine. There's a learning, but they're never going to forget
Right.
that experience. But now we have the ability to
Right.
share that experience, that learning
Mhm.
phase. And there's so many things like that. There are, I mean, again, from military and
Mhm.
civilians, like just things you would never expect to happen.
Mhm.
Let's capture that. Let's make them teachable moments. Let's give you a perspective that somebody
Mhm.
else potentially learnt the hard way.
Yeah, what a great great insight on the shared wisdom and direct mentorship, and a big game changer in that reality based training space was the impact of COVID. So social distancing and the lack of physical contact in a training environment for a long period of time, which can have great grave consequences on perishable skills. Obviously like medical care.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm sure there was impact on skills retention and observation and orientation to the patient's medical needs. Situations like that seem to be a high priority training evolution. Critically and speedily making decisions and act on and ultimately treating those patients. So did you guys see a major impact from COVID?
COVID was a tricky time for us, and
Mm-hmm.
again, this is no fault of the agencies that we're working with, but they were getting smashed in all directions, from obviously
Mm-hmm.
the patient experience to having to change a lot of their actual patient care processes. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the last thing that was on their mind was the complete reevaluation of their training systems. It was make decisions quickly,
Mm-hmm.
you know, move fast and make sure that nothing catastrophic happens. So a
Sure.
lot of our clients, I'm not going to say went dark. They're just the
Mm-hmm.
training modalities sort of were reduced priority, simply because the patient experience and the patient care process was so changeable. It was like things,
Mm-hmm.
they'd be getting new directives. All right, now this is the way we're doing things, and this has to happen now, and they'd have to be forcing change on their people very, very fast. And there's a lot of impact on the cognitive load,
Mm-hmm. For
when your
sure.
way of doing things is changing on a week by week
Yeah.
basis. So, um, look, the COVID impact on us as a business was pretty
Mm-hmm.
massive, just because it was really difficult to develop new stuff. simply
Mm-hmm.
because our customers were focused in other areas, and I don't blame them for a second.
Sure.
Very difficult time for us as a business. Um, but what came out of that was also some ideas of, hey, maybe we need to do remote training, maybe we need to do distance
Mm-hmm.
training. There was lots of ideas, but not a lot of movement,
Mm-hmm.
and that was simply because just lack of focus, lack of budget
Understood.
as
Yeah.
well. And again, budgets moved
Yeah.
around a lot. So we learned a lot. We had some good conversations, but it was a tricky time for us
Mm-hmm.
to develop new things, or to think about new
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, interesting, and I'm sure that's a shared experience across the board.
Yeah.
Speaking of the end user, I'd love to dive into the end user application. We could start with the military side.
Yep.
Um, I've got a bit of military medical training, like I was telling you when I was in the Marine Corps, and perhaps slightly a little more than the average Joe, but nowhere near the job specific experience the corpsmen or combat medics receive. And initially, when I was in the Marine Corps, I had exposure to TCCC, the Tactical Combat
Yep.
Casualty Care, with basic skills training in triage and self aid and buddy aid.
Yep.
We had the acronym March, and I don't know if I could even recall what it
Give it a
stands for.
test.
I think
Yep.
it was massive hemorrhaging, airways, um, respiratory, circulatory, and hypothermia. So yeah, I'm
Perfect.
surprised I could remember that.
There.
And yeah, and so again, yeah, that was kind of the initial medical training that we received, and on a continuing basis. Um, and beyond that, I was able to go through a live tissue training course,
Mhm.
which not all units get the opportunity to train at such an extent. But it was more scenario based with live pigs,
Yep.
which are more anatomically similar to humans.
Yep.
And we received greater in depth exposure with the actual application of life saving steps.
Yep.
We experienced the classroom instruction followed by a field training exercise, like movement to contact, room clearing, 9-line medevacs, etc. And each scenario involved a live specimen with life-threatening wounds.
Yep.
So we had to apply those lessons learned by quickly identifying wounds and treating to save the life of these pigs.
Yep.
And like we had, we're hammering this nail because I believe we still need the classroom exposure. We still need the physical field training experience.
Mm.
So, what does the EmergiSim military program look like, and who specifically is it for? And how is that being integrated in current training programs like the classroom and
Yeah.
FTX?
And again, it's that augment to that existing training. Again, the idea that you can
Mm-hmm.
go from your classroom to your simulation to then your live simulation and make that bridge as smooth as
Mm-hmm.
possible. Um, our predominant military clients have been Australian Special Operations groups,
Mm-hmm.
who have a couple of different levels of qualifications. Obviously, they'll have the military medic role,
Mm-hmm.
but they'll also have a combat first aider type person who's just a higher level of first aid care than a general operator. So they wanted to be able to test, and they wanted to be able to put all these different levels into a TCCC situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Again, with the idea of testing communications, the decision-making process, and just the application of that March framework. So that
Mm-hmm.
was, your acronym was perfect. That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
We have the bag with all of their equipment depending on their particular profile, and it's a case of you've got one or two patients to deal with. You're looking
Mm-hmm.
at establishing airways, checking for hemorrhages, making sure that there's no respiratory failure, hypothermia, hypovolemia, and then getting them ready for transport, and then communication of that transport phase, delivering the 9-liner.
Mm-hmm.
Your security detail are all AI NPC characters, so there's
Oh,
again
awesome.
communication
Mm-hmm.
between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the goal. They're the goals of the scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a number of different setups we can do that to give you several different looks. You can have a prolonged extraction, whereas your vehicle gets stuck, and now you've got a phase where you've got to move with your casualty, providing
Mm-hmm.
cover, but you've also got to then check in on your patient, make sure no
Yeah.
tourniquets
Yeah.
haven't come loose, or everything's good,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just going through that march pathway each time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was the goal, and the idea is that they could set it up and they could deploy it for different sort of qualification levels.
Mm-hmm.
Where we didn't want to make it a weapons trainer.
Hmm.
There's other people in that space who are doing the weapons based VR thing, and it wasn't a
Hmm.
high priority for us to try and build what they're building into our scenario. So it's very much a medically focused application, and then the other half of it is the facilitator comms. So explaining what's going on, calling for resources, obviously
Hmm.
accuracy and delivery of that nine liner, um, tracking and getting communication back from your facilitator. Okay, look, when are we moving? How long have we got? What's my timelines? And again, that facilitator can get quite barky and quite aggressive as well. That you need to be moving faster, or
Hmm.
we need to be getting things happening faster. So it's a good way of again prepping for that live simulation training when things
Hmm.
will become really apparent. I've talked with guys who've done that again that live pig trading type stuff, and they said,
Hmm.
look, the big realization was that smell and that
Hmm.
the viscousness of blood and all that sort of stuff was like, well,
Yeah.
that's what really becomes apparent. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
this is different to the whiteboard. So we want to
Hmm.
get as close to that experience as possible.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
Giving you a lot of looks, and again, we've got spatial audio there, so again, bullets are sort of whizzing over their head.
Hmm.
Um, you're not an immediate threat, and we didn't want to have threats to actually engage, but that's something we could add into the simulation further on down the track if it becomes necessary. Right now, it's more about just focusing on the medical interventions. And you, as the simulation participant, you don't know that there's not going to be a threat there. So it's not something we
Hmm.
define at the outset. It's just we didn't
Hmm.
want to have a target for you to be there, to be focused on shooting when you've got a medical intervention to deliver.
Hmm. Yeah. Great points. I do want to discuss what you had mentioned earlier about individuals kind of not understanding the importance of training. And I had a very similar experience when I was in the Marine Corps
Mm.
because I was young, dumb, and full of piss and vinegar.
Yeah.
And again, it's the immersion that brings on a better experience. The better experience brings on a higher sense of presence, which gives value to the importance of training, and then of course ultimately leading to higher skills transfer. And when I was a young Marine going through TCCC, um, early in my career, it was similar to stepping over those training dummies you had mentioned. We were messing around with the nasal pharyngeal, seeing if we could, choke each other, cinching down the tourniquets to cut off circulation.
Yeah.
But you know, shit got real when we went through the live tissue training course because
Yeah.
like you had mentioned, that the pigs were bleeding out, and those arterial bleeds were much different than just cinching down a tourniquet on my own arm or my buddy's arm.
Yeah.
So I can see an immense value of integrating virtual reality within and augmenting the current training programs
Yeah.
for that give a shit meter, as I call it.
Yeah.
Again, with higher immersion, higher senses of presence, um, higher fidelity, even and that's and which brings me to my next point, which is the psychological fidelity and the stress inoculation. Fully immersing with multi-sensory functionality hitting you at once, the auditory, the uh, visual, visual and audio, and then you have the psychological aspects of it increasing the immersion and giving that higher sense of fidelity. And I wanted to tell you about the International Journal of Human. It was the International Journal of Human Computer Studies. They
Okay.
had published an article concluding that presence might not be determined solely by visual fidelity, but by psychological fidelity, and the extent to which stimulus uh, presentation evokes the type of psychological and emotional response
Mm.
one would experience in real life.
Yeah.
So, and that's the gift of virtual reality, is that next step, the next evolutionary step to simulate, real world experiences.
It's a fascinating. You've probably seen this, and again, I've noticed it in people that we've worked with. That if you are the type of person that wants to be excellent in your role, so you have
Mm-hmm.
a personal value towards excellence and proficiency and all that sort of stuff, you are you are far more likely to be prepared. You're far more likely to be
Mm-hmm.
mentally ready for simulation. You're also far more likely to engage in simulation with the level of
Mm-hmm.
seriousness that they would in an operational sort of capacity. Whereas the people who don't care that much, they're a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
laissez-faire around how they attack simulation and things like that. So it's really interesting that I love putting the headset on people and watching them get into it. Like just
Mm-hmm.
love the what do you call it, the challenge of digging into this profession and digging into this role that
Mm-hmm.
they've chosen and they've embraced. And
Mm-hmm.
it's fascinating. We have these moments, and I guess they're learnable moments because again, you're in this realistic zone, but it's also a little bit unrealistic. There is you have to pull your bag off your thing. There
Mm-hmm.
are buttons and things to interact with in order to do stuff, but it's very quick. They very quickly start figuring out how to solve their own problems. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
I'd want to give this drug. Okay, cool. That drug's likely to be in this pouch. And they open up. Oh, cool. There's my drugs. Right, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just everything becomes very familiar, very quickly. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's again part of the work that we'll do when initially working with a client is to say, well, look, let's customize things. Let's make the bag layouts match your
Mm-hmm.
equipment. Let's make the truck layouts match your layout. Let's make sure the uniform. Let's make sure all the communication, the comms. Let's make sure that matches your reality, so that there
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be any of those jarring moments where something's missing, something's not where it should be, or there's just some sort of verbal interaction that doesn't make sense. So we're very lucky with our subject matter experts,
Mm-hmm.
TACBED and a bunch of the clients that we do work with, that we say, look, right, let's catalog all of the stuff here that's going to be critical to making the experience as realistic as possible,
Mm-hmm.
because I want you to just snap into go mode in simulation. And I want to be able to serve you up five, six
Mm-hmm.
different versions of a similar scenario or the same type of scenario, and give you a bunch of different looks to really challenge you and really push you in a short space of time. Because it's really interesting going from that micro interaction, but then sort of maintaining a macro view on your scene, and the switching between those two modalities. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
quite difficult, but it's something really important to practice as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So yeah, I would assume that the solutions for that you provide for the military are pretty simple to put together based on their SOPs, their operating procedures,
Yeah.
and they're typically uniform. On the civilian side, I'm not. I know nothing of the civilian sector.
Yep.
So could you walk us through like the ideal candidate and any unique features or, training methodologies being used to enhance their current training programs?
One of the again, so we started with the mass casualty brief. So the
Mm-hmm.
idea of that an active shooter or a hostile vehicle into pedestrian. I mean, again, 2020 we'd had several car into pedestrian style attacks
Mm-hmm.
in the UK, in the US. Like this was now a reality that cities and municipalities were having to prepare for. To say, well, like if there's going to be a parade, we have to be ready for this as a potential threat. So
Mm-hmm.
that was the simplest scenario idea to kick off, and it would give us the ability to generate a bunch of random patients with a bunch of different conditions. And the idea really was that we knew the kind of equipment profiles that the EMS paramedic responders would have, and we knew that a basic hemostatic bandage, tourniquet would be what a fire department or a
Mm-hmm.
police officer would potentially have in their vehicle as well. So there would be a level of adaptability that we could give between various sort of agencies. It's the same. It's the same process. You've just got
Mm-hmm.
either more or less equipment. And what's quite funny as well is we spent a lot of time building a whole load of paramedic equipment. So things like the ECG machines, the LifePak
Mm-hmm.
15, um, blood and saline, and all these extra things that they could do. But when you're in a mass casualty situation, similar to a TCCC environment, there is no
Mm-hmm.
time, space to do anything advanced. It's just patch up, put onto stretcher,
Right.
and let's get moving. And it's
Mm-hmm.
more about the
Mm-hmm.
how quickly can you triage and make decisions um, for the betterment of those patients, and then move on to the next patient. Um, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you're. There's been some
Mm-hmm.
fascinating research come out of the UK. Um, the phenomenon of over triage, in as much as particularly some of these
Mm-hmm.
large scale incidents that they've had, London Bridge, Manchester bombing type events, is that initial first responders spent too long with their initial couple of casualties providing care when they should have moved on to other patients and potentially got to them quicker. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we're messing with
Interesting.
their fundamental like value system to say, all right, provide this person with as much care, make them as comfortable as possible,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for as long as required. That's what first responders do. But we're
Mm-hmm.
also in the zone of mass casualty. You've got to throw that out a little bit and just say, look, right, the life saving interventions are done. I have to move on to the next person. The person coming behind me, the resource coming behind me, will be the person who looks after you or
Mm-hmm.
helps you to a hospital. And
Mm-hmm.
again, that's a really interesting teachable moment. Is that you can spend
Yeah.
too long. They're now
Yeah.
rolling out a
Interesting.
system
I'll have to
called
look
10-second
into that.
triage
Mm-hmm.
in the UK, which is a really interesting. It's just a faster mnemonic or approach to that initial triage process. Um, there's several systems that exist, so SMART or SALT triage
Mm-hmm.
process where you're calculating a pulse rate, you're doing all this maths in your head, and you're making a
Mm-hmm.
decision as to how you want to tag this person for casualty collection. And again, that's not the time to be doing maths or dividing anything by six in your head when you've got people
Mm-hmm.
screaming, you've got potential threats
Mm-hmm.
of cars or gunmen or any of that sort of stuff in your zone. You need to be able to make a snap decision that
Mm-hmm.
will stand up to court liability, all that sort of stuff as well, because that's the other half
Yeah.
of the equation. And how do you train that? How do you give
Yeah.
people that look?
That what an interesting point. I'd be very interested in hearing your insight on the liability and potential malpractice lawsuits because, I could see either the over reliance on simulation and the underestimation of the complexities of real patient reactions or complacency or misdiagnoses. Um, is this even a concern for VR trainers in the medical space?
Look, I think we can't ignore it. I mean, again,
Mm-hmm.
I'm of the opinion that you as humans we make the best decision we can with the information
Mm-hmm.
that's available to us, and
True. Mm-hmm.
that's all we can do. Now,
Right.
from a simulation and training point, if I've taught you a protocol, which is, let's just say it's March, right, and you go CRH, right? You did not address the two fundamental things in
Mm-hmm.
your clinical pathway, and you know,
Right.
so there is a we teach you this stuff for a reason. We teach checklists and mnemonics and things like that, so stuff doesn't get missed. We have cards, and we write the time a tourniquet has been applied in order to make sure that things don't get
Mm-hmm.
amputated unnecessarily. Like knowing that all things can
Mm-hmm.
go wrong at the same time, right? So we set up all this scaffolding in place with structure.
Mm-hmm.
Let's train it. Let's make sure it's embedded in you. Let's make sure you don't
Mm-hmm.
just academically understand it. Let's make sure you know it in your bones. And that if I
Mm-hmm.
shake you out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know exactly what March is. You
Mm-hmm.
know exactly what these processes are.
Right.
So again is an advantage for VR that it doesn't look skill
Mm-hmm.
decay. Like if you don't remember this, I want to discover it in training as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
an in-field type situation. If you haven't done if you haven't put a tourniquet on in 3 years, like I'm sure you remember the tangible skill, but would you
Mm-hmm.
identify the need for it in advance?
Right. Yeah, that's another interesting point, and I really appreciate all your insights. My brain is just firing a mile a minute here.
Yep.
The importance of incorporating pattern recognition and environmental observations within the training scenarios. If we're following John Boyd's OODA loop, the observe, orient,
Yep.
decision and action, or any other process for critical thought.
Yep.
um, you know, I'd like to shift to the simulation itself. Uh, is there integration for props? I know you had brought up the car seat, but for example, like in a scenario where there's an open pill bottle on the floor and an unconscious victim on the bed, that observation obviously aids in the assessment to potential contributing factors
Yep.
like a medical overdose.
Yep.
Um, so I'm not in the field, but props in the scenario where a team is communicating,
Yep.
the ability to prioritize the treatment, like you had talked about, the importance of triage, the importance of the OODA loop, or any other type of critical thought process. By observing, you're orienting, you make the decision, and then there's an action, and
Yep.
then you act upon it. So is there the capability or plans to expand the scenario portfolio to add these features?
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about so signs and symptoms. I think is where our stuff really stands out.
Mm-hmm.
So visually, visually, we've worked very hard to make sure that you can see dilation of pupils, that you can see changes
Mm-hmm.
in the skin tone and the lip color, depending on the health
Mm-hmm.
of the patient. Um, Blood pooling below a wound, blood seeping through the clothes, blood coming through on your gloves as a participant if there is a wound below the
Okay.
clothing. You can observe rise and fall of the chest. So
Mm.
in the event of a tension on one side of the chest, you can see a difference in the rise and fall of the chest between two sides. So we want to make all this stuff observable,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no prompts or arrows, as I said before, no indications of that. You've got to find it yourself.
Gotcha.
You can listen for breathing. You can feel
Mm-hmm.
pulse. We have haptic vibration for pulse points.
Mm-hmm.
You can roll the patients onto either side to sort of look. You can cut away their clothing, um, and then obviously if you attach things like like ECG leads and things like that, or pulse oximeters, you can check you know
Mm-hmm.
all those signs and symptoms as you would do in a regular assessment. Now, that's very much for the EMS paramedic space. But if you're law enforcement or fire,
Mm-hmm.
pulse are they breathing? Can I hear breathing? Can I see the chest going up and down? Like it's still the same stuff, but
Right.
they've got a different frame of
Right.
reference for it.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Maybe more ABCs than
yeah, yeah.
a more intricate checklist. Yeah.
So that's all built, and that's I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what sets us apart from our competitors in this space. The
Mm-hmm.
next
Mm-hmm.
zone for okay, so then just to your point, right? So we've got a drug overdose. There are syringes in the corner. That obviously
Mm-hmm.
it's a decrepit hotel room. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
bad stuff going on. We don't have a pill bottle as such, but again, an interaction with
Right.
pill bottle is not difficult.
Mm-hmm.
With anything in our scenarios, we want you to be able to read the label. We want you. So again, we sort of
Mm-hmm.
looked at the idea of drug labs and things like that, where you could actually look at what's flammable, explosive type
Mm-hmm.
chemicals, or what's a potential chemical risk in the scenario. We want you to be able to pick up the label and actually read what's in the bag or in the can, or that sort of thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess to your other point, what's the future direction? The next biggest win for us is looking at responsive patients. So incorporating this large
Mm-hmm.
language model idea of AI responses, and giving our NPCs the ability to communicate and deliver information, information that has to be elicited by the participant. So
Yeah, yeah, that was my next question. I was going to ask if there's any bystander interaction or communication skills training.
yeah, so a lot of it is trigger based at the moment, in as much as that via
Mm-hmm.
proximity that they will deliver you information, or they'll give you a limited amount of information, or
Mm-hmm.
they'll throw in distractions, red herrings to you as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have things like threats, um, aggression levels rising. So the longer you spend with a particular patient, your bystanders get
Mm-hmm.
more and more agitated, to the point where they actually start
Oh,
threatening
okay.
the participants. And it's not as though they're going to start doing anything to the participants, but we want them to be aware
Mm-hmm.
of that, to say, all right, look, hang on,
Mm-hmm.
you can't threaten to kill me. That's
Mm-hmm.
I want to
Right.
step away from my patient just to make sure that that's okay. So again, teachable
Mm-hmm.
moments, but there's so much more we can go with that, with these intelligent avatars or intelligent
Mm-hmm.
NPCs, which is about the eliciting of information, asking good questions. It
Mm-hmm.
opens up a whole range of things around um, mental health,
Mm-hmm.
de-escalation, again, potentially suicidal, or
Interesting.
trying to
Yeah.
understand people with suicidal thoughts, which again are difficult to simulate. They're tricky
Mm-hmm.
to assess, and then what can we sort of put across in those teachable moments as well?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Um, so I saw that well, what appeared to be a single module in the Steam launcher for $5.99 for one of the experiences.
Yep.
How is the software being distributed? Are
We
you
do.
going towards a downloadable platform or
That was
a
an
SaaS model?
Yeah, that was a
Mhm.
marketing experiment, which I'm still quite proud of, given as much as we it was more to sort of check out Steam as a distribution platform.
Uh-huh.
Um, it was there for people to try and experience in a simple fashion, and I was hoping
Mhm.
paramedics would find it and find it as a cooler
Yeah.
piece of kit that we could get feedback from.
Yeah.
To this day, it sells a couple of units a day, which is I'm
Oh,
consistently surprised at. It doesn't seem to
yeah.
be anyone who's actually involved in any sort of medical capability, which blows my mind.
Right.
Um,
Well, I'm sure farmers aren't playing Farming Simulator, and maybe truckers aren't playing Trucking
Trucker Simulator,
Simulator,
yeah, exactly. So
but but yeah, I just accidentally stumbled upon it. I was actually looking for a game, and I was like, let me look up and see if EmergiSim
yeah,
has anything in the market.
yeah,
And lo and behold, you had one.
yeah. It gives you a very brief taste of the capabilities.
Mhm.
Again, we'll
Yeah,
send you a full working
it
version. You can
looked
do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It looked, yeah, either a Steam key, or yeah, a full working version, but it looked pretty in depth. Buying it crossed my mind for sure.
I'll give you a more comprehensive version so you can look at some of the other
Perfect.
scenarios as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, there we go. That was sort of an experience, really, just to test it as a distribution platform. So
Mhm.
we will. Our process at the moment is we work very closely with an agency around the adaptation of our existing suite of
Mhm.
scenarios. I say, well, what's most relevant for your agency? What's the key equipment deliverables that make it make sense for you? Um,
Mhm.
that's means we have a longer process. It means we're much more in your as a development partner, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, we have less of a productized offering, and that was sort of what we're looking at this year. How do we make something that's a little bit more off the shelf and less onerous from a purchasing standpoint? But
Mhm.
that's also us trying to determine exactly what the customer wants, which is always
Mhm.
tricky. So we've
Right.
not received any external funding outside of a out of an Epic Mega Grant that we got a couple of
Mhm.
years ago. We are completely client funded, self funded. In our, we're still very much a
Mhm.
startup in our ethos, but also in our bank balance. So
Mhm.
we're looking to sort of grow the number of agencies that we work with. That's an awareness piece more than anything else. The challenge for us is that we picked the pre-hospital space, which
Mhm.
never has budget set aside for virtual reality training. They barely have
Mhm.
budgets to pay their people and to keep their trucks on the road and all the rest of it. So,
Mhm.
as a business decision, that was probably not the smartest.
Mhm.
Maybe we should have gone the surgical route, but I don't think that's where our expertise was, and I don't think that's where
Right.
our values lie as well. We want to be
Yeah.
reduce the number of preventable deaths at the point of injury. If we have a mission, that's what it is, and it's about those critical first life-saving interventions. It's about the communication and the handover of that patient into the
Mhm.
next phase of their transport. Get them to the hospital where the proper care can be provided. That's the job
Mhm.
of the first responder in a civilian or a military context. Yeah, you have no other priority other
Mhm.
than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. How do you envision emergency medical VR trainings evolution in the next 5, 10 years, especially with the adoption of augmented reality? Like you had mentioned, some generative AI or voice commands,
Yeah.
maybe remote collaborations and communications with 5G or Starlink and beyond. So, what are your thoughts around that?
It's really interesting to say. I mean, obviously the genesis of where the headsets are going is the most interesting
Hmm.
thing. So we pay a lot of attention to the location based entertainment VR market. So
Hmm.
your zero latency type things. So what's the technology that they're using? Um, our competitors in the space as well. I mean, if there starts to become a headset of choice, we want to address our stuff to what the prevailing technology is. We're device agnostic. So yeah, we try and work
Hmm.
with as many different hardwares as we can, because we just don't know what our clients are going to want to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and essentially, they want the simplest, easiest to deploy, most portable,
Mm-hmm.
robust solution they can have. So
Right.
where that ends up from a hardware perspective is difficult to say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess what future for us, yeah, more AI, the ability to customize scenarios at an easier level, to be able, a train the trainer type model where you can build
Mm-hmm.
your own, learning outcomes into your own scenarios, I think is very important. And expanding the after action review component of what we do as well. So
Mm-hmm.
when you replay a scenario, just giving yourself more looks to
Mm-hmm.
be able to say, right, like let's identify the real
Mm-hmm.
learning points or the failure points of
Right.
your training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and having those discussions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's also
perfect.
the idea that AI could actually spot areas of performance
Mm-hmm.
improvement. So,
Mm,
in the idea that there's a
right.
mass casualty with 10 people spread out over an area, like, is there an
Mm-hmm.
optimal path that you can take? Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Again, there's different agencies will have different protocols. Like, you might have to just walk
Mm-hmm.
the scene and do a full observation, then make a decision of where you start, or do you just start on the closest person to you and start working your way through?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I did read a study on command and control and the integration of AI as a commander. I'm
Mm,
not familiar with it or confident enough to regurgitate it right
sure.
now, but I could definitely shoot that over to you because it's really quite interesting from a commander perspective,
Yeah.
utilizing resources and the environment and the multi domains from ground, air, sea to cybersecurity and
Yeah.
space. So really interesting stuff. Um, Mick, is there any other topic that you want to explore that maybe I hadn't brought up?
No, I would just say, look, I think just to that point, I mean, we're not trying to do the bird's eye scene commander type stuff, even though we've had people ask us about that kind of technology. Again, we want to have it as the first person view type training, the either as a solo operator or as small teams, with a
Mhm.
communication facility to your resources and to your scene commander type roles. That's our lane at the moment, pretty much in that pre-hospital space.
Mhm.
We're really passionate about delivering better competency, better resilience, the idea that we can alleviate the potential for post-traumatic disorders. Again, you'll have traumatic stress
Mhm.
as in this role. That's kind of unavoidable, but it's also how you manage it and how you potentially deal with the aftermath of it. If VR can help you develop resilience in that space,
Mhm.
through confidence, competency, drilling for skills,
Mhm.
prepping for, training like you fight, as we sort of
Mhm.
alluded to before. I think that's really important for us. But look, we're keen to see how this space develops, and at the end of the day, as long as we stay customer focused and as long as we're trying to address
Mhm.
the issues that these agencies have, and they've got a lot of things on their plate, and training being a massive priority that never has the budget it deserves.
Mhm.
We'll do our best to sort of address that and to meet the clients where they need to be.
Mhm. Excellent. Mick, thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to meet with me. If anyone's interested in further information, who can they or where can they reach out to?
If you jump onto vr.emergisim.com, that's our main landing page. You can get in touch with us there. Happy to sort of schedule remote demonstrations. We've got guys traveling around in various sort of areas of the world. So if we can sync up for a live demonstration, that's great too. But yeah, that's probably the easiest place to connect with us.
Yeah, perfect. And of course, like I had said, I'd love to have another discussion, including yourself, Jessica Cantrick, and anyone else from the EmergiSim team to talk in greater detail the downstream impacts and end user experiences of your programs.
Absolutely. Love to do it.
Right. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Cheers.